Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Soil Health Partnership's Wheat Week. My name is Keith Byerly, and I am the field manager for Kansas and Nebraska with the Soil Health Partnership. This is day 2 of Wheat Week, where we will be talking with some of our Kansas wheat growers today, as well as some local extension. To bring you the best experience today, we ask that you turn off all other programs on your device and web browsers you may be running to get the best video quality. We will be showing several videos, and this will allow you to fully optimize those videos. And just as a precaution, we did shoot much of this on location outside, so you may need to adjust your volume from time to time to account for background noise. The Soil Health Partnership, or SHP, is a farmer-led and farmer-focused nonprofit research group that is an initiative of the National Corn Growers Association with support from more than 100 organizations. With 200 plus on-farm research sites in 16 states, we help growers implement management practices and collect data to evaluate those practices that are important to farms. We are working in collaboration with General Mills, the National Wheat Foundation, and our state wheat organizations to research wheat's high potential to integrate conservation practices. With these partnerships, SHP is able to apply its expertise and focus on wheat's unique role in soil health. I'd like to remind everyone to join us tomorrow for the conclusion of Wheat Week. Tomorrow, we will be joined by Minnesota SHP farmers Glenn Jelly and Trinity Creek Ranch. You can register for that event at soilhealthpartnership.org/events. As a brief reminder of our agenda today, we will be visiting again with Justin Kanoff and Garrett Kennedy at Kanoff Farms, visiting with Michael Jordan, having some demonstrations from out in the field, and a conversation with Jay Wisby, K-State Extension. Before we begin, though, I would like to remind everyone that we will be having a live question and answer session with our growers with tomorrow's Field Day event. If you have any questions today that you would like answered, we'd like to ask you to type them into the question and answer box, and we will record that content and have it tomorrow when we have all of our growers together at the end of the Minnesota Field Day. So to kick things off today, I would like to introduce Justin Kanoff and Garrett Kennedy to give us an overview of Kanoff Farms. Kanoff's SHP field is a piece of ground that they haven't had all of that long, and they identified it as a piece of ground that was not as productive as some of their other farms. Let's listen to their thoughts on soil health and why they became interested in working with the Soil Health Partnership.
So, tell me a little bit about the operation. Tell me what role each one of you play in the operation, where we're at, and kind of the crops that are involved here. So.
Okay. Well, our farm is located in central Kansas, just outside of Salina. We're an all dryland farm that focuses on crop production. I farm alongside my dad and my brother. My brother and I are the 5th generation of our family to farm in this region. We are growing wheat and soybeans, grain sorghum, alfalfa hay, corn. We are raising little triticale now as well, and no-till diverse environment, and incorporating some cover crops within that cropping system. Started to look at trying to learn how to incorporate some grazing and some livestock impact back into our cropping system. We're doing it at a fairly small scale. At this point in time, it's not scaled across the entire farm by any means, but I'm working with a neighbor, a friend of mine, who knows a lot more about livestock than I do and has interest in it. We've sat down and agreed upon some common goals that we both want to get out of this partnership and this collaboration. And so we're really, this is the second time that we've done some grazing on some cropland, some grazing of an annual cover crop. We can get more into the reasons why we're doing that down the road here, but yeah, that's kind of a new new thing as we continue to march down this path of a resilient, biologically based system.
So Garrett, tell me about your role here on the farm.
Well, sure. I'm the agronomist for the farm, and so I do a lot of the crop scouting, provide advice as what we're seeing in the field and how our different management practices changing what we're seeing in the field. So try to be a partner in those decisions as we march towards our goals.
As well as handling a lot of the precision ag duties.
Yeah, exactly. Try to help make field operations as efficient as possible by doing some precision work. Managing yield data and those different type of ideas as well.
How did you learn about Soil Health Partnership, and what got you interested enough in what SHP does to say that let's do a research field out here and we'll start there?
Well, not unlike a lot of farmers, soil health has been something that we've been thinking about for quite some time. We really see the ability of our soils to function well, particularly in the way that they can infiltrate water, store water, and have it be available for the crop when it needs it, is one of the most critical things to our success long term. So if we can improve our ability to capture, store, and have that water available for our crops, that's of utmost importance. A big focus item for our farm when we think about resiliency and across time. The risk to using cover crops and a lot of our apprehension early was using our soil stored moisture to grow a cover crop and having that be a detriment to the subsequent grain crop that we get paid to grow, right? And so we spent some time looking at that before we adopted cover crops on a wider scale. I think we did 3 years of on-farm testing, replicated trials, and we had a statistical significant yield loss one of those 3 years, but it was like 1.5 bushels. Never had a yield advantage in those years that we did those on-farm trials early on, but saw differences in weed control, differences in soil temperature during the growing crop, and some advantages, and then just the overall premise of adding more carbon back into the soil and adding more diversity into our system and increasing the robustness of the biological system has moved us to scale integrating cover crops across the vast majority of the farm now.
With the incorporation of wheat, you're looking at the long game as well with what you're doing out here and thinking about the nutrient density of the product that you're producing. Can you talk just a little bit about your thought process behind that?
One of the questions that we have that we're looking at specifically with this soil health partnership project is, as we improve our soil health and improve the biological functioning of our soils, will we see a difference, a measurable difference in grain quality when we think about either from a standpoint of maybe we have a more stable flour that has a better mixing stability, or maybe we have better protein contents in our wheat, or maybe it's just more consistent as far as how it performs when it's baked, or maybe we have differences in the nutrient content in that grain. So a lot of consumers today want clean labels. That when they look at, I know when my wife goes to town to the store, she'll look at labels like a lot of folks shopping at the store, and the longer that ingredient list is, the less excited she is about buying that product. And I know that General Mills and other food companies are trying to learn about ways to have a cleaner label. And so if by chance, by improving our soil health, we can have better strength in our dough, or higher zinc content in our grain, which leads to higher zinc in these baked products, and that's not something that has to be added in as an extra ingredient. It's a win for the consumer, for the food company, and hopefully for the farm if we can share in that value. That's the really important piece, is the farms have to be able to share in that value that is delivered by building that soil health.
I think that's one of the things we're really excited about what Soil Health Partnership is bringing to the table, is that we think we've seen some of these changes over time and what the different impacts we've had. We're tracking organic matter and seeing that grow over time. But what we really need help with is giving us more data, more metrics, and that I think the sampling and the things that Soil Health Partnership is doing is really helping us measure those things that we're actually seeing in the field.
Great.
My thanks to Justin and Garrett for taking time to sit down with me. We will be talking to them again a little bit later out in the field about how they're incorporating grazing into their operation. Now I want to take the time to introduce Mike Jordan. Mike has been interested in cover crops and has tried them on his operation in north central Kansas a handful of times in the past 20 years. And honestly has seen varying degrees of success during that time. I invite you now to hear more about Mike's operation and his soil health journey to date. Mike, tell us a little bit about your operation and who all is involved and some of the specific challenges that your geography has for you.
Okay, I farm with my son Gregory and the help of my wife and one couple part-time helpers during harvest and the like. And we are strictly a no-till operation. We've been no-till since the 1990s. And we grow corn, wheat, milo, soybeans, not in that order. It's actually usually most wheat's number one, milo number two, and soybeans right there with it. Corn is just kind of a little tag along. Corn helps spread out the planting and harvest seasons a little bit, and the fact that I can use Roundup corn leaves me using it on where I have shatter cane problems or other weed problems that milo herbicides won't take care of. My rotation is usually a year or 2 years of wheat, following that with a feed grain, either the milo or the corn, and follow that up with beans. And as soon as the beans are harvested, we plant the wheat again.
So I know that you have been no-till on your operation for quite some time. When did you make the full conversion to no-till? And for your area of the country here, I know I see a fair amount of, I still see a fair amount of tillage done in fallow years and things like that. So kind of how is that mix for this particular geography?
Well, I first started doing any no-till in 1994. That first year convinced me it was a pretty good idea. By 96, I really started seriously no-tilling and transitioning from tillage to no-till. And the last time I tilled anything on any field was 1999. The normal around here has changed a lot over the years. No-till has increased a lot of acres until it's the primary tillage system in this area. That said, the last couple years I have seen an increase in tillage on people trying to control Palmer amaranth, especially in their wheat stubble between that time and the following year's crop, whether it's wheat in the fall or planting usually milo in the spring.
I know that this isn't your first foray into cover crops, so tell me a little bit about the history and some of the ebb and flow of cover crops on your operation through the years.
I first tried cover crops in 1999 or 1999, 99 or 2000, and I grew 40 acres of hairy vetch. I was reading about the possibility of it providing some nitrogen for the upcoming milo crop. We had a fairly dry September, and it goes into September when it's planted. And it didn't rain, and maybe 10% of the crop came up, and about 10% of the crop came up every year for the next 8 or 10 years. It wasn't a problem, but we obviously didn't get much good out of it either. I have planted some cover crops off and on over the years, trying to get some results. A couple times, very happy with the material that was produced, the growth, the radishes opening the soil up, providing cover for wildlife, contributing to the organic matter on the soil. and generally looking good, as if they weren't short of nitrogen. So I presume they were probably pulling the nutrients up out of the soil and leaving them on top of the ground where they might have eventually leached away, but instead making them available for the next crop. So I like those features. My biggest problem has been the years when I have planted cover crops and it didn't rain for 6 weeks. It didn't rain for 4 weeks. Or as in last year, my first year growing cover crops under the Soil Health Partnership, I planted cover crops in September and we got our first early harvest freeze we've ever had about 5 weeks later. And my cover crops were only about 3 inches tall before they were terminated, mostly by the weather. Anything that survived that freeze really just barely held on to life for the rest of the fall. One of the most fortuitous times, or obvious times, for growing cover crops is after harvesting wheat in June and not planting a crop until the following spring, which leaves the ground open for 8-10 months. And that is a good chance to grow something, it seems like. But the problem can be is we harvest in June, and July and August can be very dry in Kansas. And September through December, we average less than an inch of rain a year. And that generally means you get either 2 inches or nothing. So the challenge has been for me is not wasting my money every second time I plant the cover crops. I mean, no-till has helped a lot in terms of improving the organic matter in the soil and improving soil structure. We've had our soil organic matters improve from 1.4% to the low to mid 2%. That's a substantial increase, 60 to 80% in many cases. But I would like to see it go a bit further. Our native pastures can be 3% organic matter or higher, depending on the quality of the soil. And what I'm doing isn't getting any better. We've kind of reached it. And if I want to improve it more, gain the extra carbon in the soil, a chance for the organic matter happen to retain more water and recycle more nutrients, I'm going to have to do something different. So I appreciate the help of the Soil Health Partnership, both for consulting and the financial help, and helping to support my experiments and do the soil health studies and such likes that'll let us see if we can have a success out of this, find the winning combination.
Well, I certainly hope that Mike's comments about the earliest frost we ever had aren't trumped this week by the weather that we're experiencing here in the Western Corn Belt. But thank you, Mike, and we will be coming back to you in just a little while. I again want to remind everyone that our live question and answer session with both our Kansas growers and both of our Minnesota growers will be during tomorrow's session. And as a reminder, you can submit those questions now, and we will carry them over until tomorrow. Now I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and I'd like to take you out to one of our trial sites. Measuring soil health doesn't have to be a complex or even an expensive process. For much of Kansas, available water is undoubtedly the #1 yield limiting factor we have to deal with regardless of crops most years. So it stands to reason that we want every drop that falls from the sky to go into our soil so that we not only have it to grow our crops, but we also can prevent erosion and maximize soil health with that water. Here's a demonstration on how you can do one of these tests on your own field using materials that you probably already have laying around the shop or in the kitchen at home.
Hello and welcome back to our Justin Kanoff strip trial site. Again, we don't have any active management practices in play yet on this field, but we're going to talk some more about baseline tests and understanding where we're at to start with as we understand where we want to go and what we want to get to moving forward. So right now, all I've done is I've got 2 jugs of water. We've gone out to our field and we've collected basically a 1-inch cube of soil that goes down 2 inches. So a 1 inch by 1 inch by 2 inch cube of soil right off the top of our soil. So we've got 2 inches of topsoil here, and we're going to do what's called an immersion study, or an aggregate stability test by immersion. So we're going to drop these in and start a 5-minute timer on these. And as they're going, we'll just kind of talk about what we're seeing out here. So the idea of this test is to really give us an understanding of how stable our soils are when they're subjected to being waterlogged or immersed in water. This idea helps us understand that when we get a rainfall, we always know that the top soil has to get wet before water percolates and moves by gravity into deeper depths of the soil. And if that topsoil can stay together and hold its structure and hold its pore spacing together, that's going to let water infiltrate and move by gravity down into our deeper depths quicker and allow us to absorb more water per hour. More of the rainfall event goes into our field instead of going down the slope and towards the creeks and the rivers and carrying soil along with it. So the idea behind this is, like I said, that these soils are going to hold together. So after a little bit more than a minute here, you can see that we're starting to see some of our soils kind of come apart. And while we're maintaining a pretty good structure to our cube itself, we've definitely got some flaking of soils and things like that going on down through this. And these soils are bound together by a number of factors. Factor number one is the lack of tillage. When we don't incorporate tillage into it, we don't mechanically break up these aggregates that we've already got in our soils. So we check that box here for this site. This was in alfalfa for several years. It went no-till into wheat last fall. We haven't seen any sort of tillage implement on this field for several years. So one check mark to the good for aggregate stability. The next thing is those root exudates that you hear people talk about. The idea that growing and active roots in the soil help us take the sugar that is made by photosynthesis by our plants and turn that into starches and sugars that go down and are stored in the soil. And that's not only the sugars there, there's also exudates that come off of those roots. And that is the glue that holds these soil particles together. It gives them the resistance that when you shake them a little bit, when you put some friction to them, when you put moisture moving past them, instead of slaking off and falling apart, they hold together and they are resistant to, I've never heard this term used, this is something I'm going to say and it's probably wrong, to erosion by gravity. When we see those particles fall apart and they go down and they plug the pore spaces in it, just like acne does to a human, they plug our pore spaces, everything backs up and it sets on the surface. So, you know, I'm going to give these just a little bit of a shake here and you're going to see exactly what I'm talking about. So I do that and we get a fair amount of stuff that comes off of that. But all in all, the fact that this was in alfalfa for a number of years has given us another check mark to the plus in our column here. Alfalfa is going to be growing, it's going to be green, it's going to be photosynthesizing as much of the year as we could possibly get out of almost any crop. And while we don't get that biodiversity, which steps into the third piece of it, biodiversity and the rotation of crops, having wheat, sorghum, corn, soybeans, cover crops like cereal rye, like mung beans, like radishes and turnips, our brassicas, peas, all of those different components out of this do different things to the soil as those roots grow down in there. Some of them do really great jobs of grabbing and scavenging nitrogen or other mineral components that are left behind from fertilizer applications. Some of them do a great job of fixing nitrogen. Some of them do a wonderful job of making a lot of little tiny tunnels in the soil that hopefully we can hold together because of those root exudates. But it's that biological community. It's putting all of those pieces together that get us to the point where we have a more resilient soil. So we're at about 4 minutes here now on this immersion test, and things have pretty well stabilized. We don't see a whole lot of stuff falling off of this anymore, and I could talk all day, but we're going to end it right here, just short of our 5-minute mark. So I'm going to pull this out, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to extract our soil out of this one. I'm going to do the same thing here on our other side. And pull that one out. And all in all, you would have to give those soil particles at least a decent grade for what we see out here as a baseline on this. While we certainly don't have water that I would be really excited to take a chug of, to take a drink of, we certainly don't have these cubes of soil that have completely disintegrated either. And I have seen both this year in different soils where after 5 minutes this is completely gone, after 5 minutes this is almost clear enough that you wouldn't be afraid to take a drink out of it. And again, there's nothing fancy about this. I took some chicken wire and bent myself a basket out of the chicken wire to make these baskets. I bought a couple of these flasks on Amazon for I think it was $5 for a pair of them. So in this case, I've got about $6 to $10 into a couple of tools that I can use to measure this. And one other point I want to make about this aggregate stability and this immersion test is this will change depending on the time of year, depending on the crops that you've got growing, depending on the growth stage of those crops that are out there. When I've got actively growing roots out there, it may slow down a little bit because there's roots in those root channels. If I've just terminated a cover crop, it may look a little bit better because those root channels are there and there's places for water to go and it's moving throughout it. In this case, where we're in fallow right now, pre-cover crop planting, what this looks like 30 days after the cover crop planting versus 3 months or 30 days after the wheat harvest versus 60 days or 90 days after the wheat harvest is going to look a little bit different as our biological activity slows down, as the biologicals in the soil use up some of the carbons and things like that help hold our soils together. So this is a constantly moving target, but it's always something that you can do a comparison of. If you've got two fields side by side that have different crops or different practices on it, you can always take these things into consideration to understand how your soils are holding together and what you can do and what is being effective for your farm to make a soil that's more resilient to this degradation. I hope that demonstration showed just how easy it can be to do your own evaluation on aggregate stability. But more so, I hope it stimulates the thought process in you on what's important to you and your operation and how you might measure it yourself on the farm. Now I want to go a little bit different route with our next speaker and bring in Jay Wisby from K-State Extension to talk about some of the observations he has had from his work with producers locally in the Saline area and thoughts on last year's wheat growing season and considerations for this next year.
I'm Jay Wisby. I am the crop production agent here at Central Kansas District, which is Saline and Ottawa County, Kansas, for Kansas State Research and Extension. Been in this job for all of about a year now, and yeah, we're very dryland transition area as far as part of the state, as far as how much moisture we get varies from year to year. Whether we're farther in the west or farther in the east is kind of dependent on the year, I guess.
So if we rewind the clock to about 10 months ago when the 2020 wheat crop was going in the ground, starting at that point in time with some drier conditions, especially to the north, what were the challenges that we saw throughout the growing season of the 2020 wheat crop here in central Kansas?
Yeah, we started out, early wheat got put in the ground was pretty good actually as far as moisture was concerned. As we got a little further along, behind soybeans for instance, a lot of our double crop wheat faced some pretty dry soils, and just getting it up took quite a while actually. Many of our double crops didn't come up, and the later planted didn't show up until the middle of winter really, where some of it started to come out of the ground. So that was the dry conditions. And then moving forward into that, in April we had a frost. April 13th we had a major frost, and it set back a lot of our wheat around here, especially some of the early maturing type wheat, some of that came up a little sooner. The later maturings tend to benefit from or recover from it better, I should say. So
So some of the wheat fields that I scouted in late April and May, I thought that I probably saw maybe 2 out of every 3 tillers that were frost damaged and no longer viable. Was that fairly consistent across the area and across varieties, or did anything do particularly different?
Yeah, it's in our area. We had several that had 50% tiller loss, for, like you say. It was kind of field to field though, where it lies as far as how low it was to, where the cold sets in the valleys, whatnot, might hit a little colder than it was. 3 degrees temperature makes so much difference when it comes to wheat surviving or just go ahead and making it through. And if it survived, it did better.
So with 50% and maybe even some of the low ground, maybe even more loss on the tillers, was there much consideration that you in Extension and your colleagues had to help growers work through on the viability of leaving the crop in, or was it time to terminate and switch gears to a different cash crop for this growing or the spring?
Yeah, I went out and visited several fields. Very few of them actually got tore out. Just a few up north really that got hit harder with a frost in one little area that really benefited from just moving on to soybeans or whatever the crop may be. Most of it, they left. Wheat's so darn resilient that it can come through things that you wouldn't expect. So, and it proved that that was the right decision in many cases.
So how did that affect growers' decisions on spring fertilizer, and as we moved on in a little bit later with the fungicides and insect control and things like that with a reduced tiller count?
Yeah, several people, we got some rust coming in early, and people were looking at it, but then they were also looking at their stands and questioning whether or not it justifies any more input. Just grain prices in general were kind of tough, and if your crop doesn't make a very good yield, it's hard to justify. So that played a big role with several producers as far as whether they went ahead and sprayed the fungicide or not. So I think it reduced our acres of fungicide for sure.
So Jay, with 2020 being a wetter year, not to keep going back to 2020, but did we see a bit different disease pressure last year because of the weather than maybe we normally see? And does any of that translate to starting a disease triangle for the 2021 wheat?
Oh, that's a good question. Early on, I think I seen more tan spot maybe than normal. It's in certain fields, you'd find this one, what is going on with my wheat? And that was kind of an issue. Later on, we had stripe rust, which you can't really count on rust every year because it's not overwintering here. So it comes from the south and blows up with the wind. And it came fairly early, and we had nice, cool, good fill conditions. So that's it's a pretty devastating disease, actually. Stripe rust is, on the rust spectrum, can rob yield in a hurry. Following that up, when the heat did get here, we had leaf rust as well. So we tend to have rust. It's just a matter of when it gets here and being on top of, where is it now and how is it progressing. You can kind of hear reports from the south, and you get a better idea when you need to be looking.
So then as we moved through the month of June and into July and got this crop out of the field, how did things perform all in all for this area of Kansas in this growing season?
Yeah, our fill period came in and it actually stayed fairly cool. We didn't get that hot, dry spell that we get some years, and we had excellent fill conditions. And so the wheat really, the tillers that survived really responded, and it produced higher than anything I was expecting. In our plots, I would have guessed it probably did about 15 bushel higher on average than I was expecting, a couple months earlier for sure. I was pleasantly surprised, really.
What were the biggest take-home lessons from the 2020 wheat crop that we need to be cognizant of, we need to store in the memory banks going forward?
Yeah, it's just wheat's resilient. I mean, it's amazing what it can come out of. It's hard to count it out, really. When going through that, you don't know what's going to happen in the future, and I've just seen it recover so darn well. It's amazing. Yeah, that's really what happened this year. And I don't know if you can take this year, if you start looking at varieties and stuff, and you can look at this year, it some of them varieties that may have got hit a little harder by the frost, it's hard to count them completely out. You might want to use more than one set of yield data, several years, so that you can choose the right variety for your farm, because this year, is different, but every year is different, so you can't just put too much credit in this one year alone, I guess.
What is wheat's place for Kansas, and specifically this north central region of Kansas? What's wheat's place in it, and where do you see that going? Do you think that the acreage is going to continue to kind of hold steady? Do you see other crops taking more acres away? What are you seeing or hearing?
We're right here in the transition area from east to west, so as prices decline, we've seen wheat acres fall pretty severe in our last, let's say 10 years, for instance. We've lost like 100,000 acres in our 2-county area. So yeah, that's been the trend. Now, I don't know how much lower it's going to get than it is right now currently, but if prices don't stay, somewhat, it's got to earn its own way on the farm as well. But we love it as a rotation as well, so it's got other factors there too.
That's exactly what I was going to ask next. With kind of that decline in acreage, what are you telling growers, what are you showing growers on the effect that has in the biodiversity of their farms and their fields?
Yeah, we've got the ability to grow a tremendous amount of different variations of crops here, from grain sorghum to corn. Soybeans have really been picking up acres, soybeans have, and wheat. So with our issues with some of our weed pressures that are becoming harder and harder to control now, pigweed specifically, wheat is just one of those ways we can get away from maybe the kind of herbicides that we might use in some of those other crops. So it's really good to keep that rotation going and just keep it circling, as far as, just having that rotation to improve your weed spectrum and just become integrated weed management, I guess.
So as you look at your growers, maybe kind of transitioning away from wheat for just a second, what do you guys kind of view as the incorporation of the other soil health metrics into the growers' operations right now? Where do you guys sit as far as no-till? Where do you sit as far as the use of cover crops and things like that for your 2 counties?
Yeah, I think we're around a third no-till, something like that, as far as, I don't have the stats in front of me right now, something like that. Those people and the other 2/3 is probably conventional till. We've got a pretty good rotation amongst even the no-tillers and maybe some minimum tillers, I guess. There's a transition there too. Other soil health metrics, people have been incorporating some cover crops. It works real well for the guys with cattle, it seems like. I love the idea of being able to make the whole farm work together, make everything profitable. And at the end of the time, it's got to work out from an economic standpoint to be sustainable. And really, that's the bottom line for everybody.
So as I move away from wheat producing areas, as I go east across this country, cereal rye becomes the de facto choice in so many of those cover crop decisions. Mm-hmm. As we get out here on the fringes of wheat country, and as we fully enter the wheat country going west, cereal rye is almost a dirty phrase to a lot of these growers, because it can turn into a control issue very quickly on these rotations. So what do you see growers selecting as kind of the basis of their cover crop mixes for the area?
I think it's cereal rye has been renowned as being one of the best cover crops, right? It's got a good root system. It grows good foliage up tall, kind of like you like to see for ground cover. People, in lieu of doing cereal rye, have tried triticale. That's one that happens a lot around here. That's probably the main one that people have used. There's some people that are using some cereal rye as well. It's just making sure they terminate in a good fashion, and maybe put it in a place that doesn't drain across the whole countryside kind of scenario, pick their locations and things of that nature.
Do you see growers use wheat itself as a cover much?
To a point, but not, it's not, I guess, Maybe a little. Some of the volunteer gets tossed in there, but we worry about wheat streak mosaic in that situation, and you don't want to cause that green bridge so that the insects can go from one field to the next, and that can be devastating. And you don't do it to yourself, much less the neighbors. So that's really kind of the really downfall of that idea.
How about nutrient considerations for that crop that might follow up that wheat when they're not used to growing wheat? How about the carbon and nitrogen and all of those pieces that they kind of have to manage?
Yeah, wheat leaves a lot of residue behind. So when you're trying to go back to the next crop, you need to find a way to get that nitrogen incorporated through that residue, I would say following wheat, for instance, and get your nitrogen in the soil, get those things so that they don't tie up with the carbon. That it's just a matter of time. You'll eventually get it, but you got to get it to the plant when it's needed, and that's key. And
that can be really tough if you follow wheat up with something that has a high early nitrogen demand
for sure
out there.
Yeah, for sure. Placement, getting it where it belongs, when it belongs there, and so it's available.
How does a grower go about connecting with the local resource that they have for extension, and where can they find the way to get in touch with those folks?
Oh, there's a good question. You can find us online. You can look up Kansas State Research and Extension. You'll find your local county, your local district. You can go there and find the web page, and it's not just crops. It's also livestock. It's also a whole list of different things that Extension covers, not just 4-H and all the other options. We've got community vitality and a lot of things, really. So that's where I'd suggest starting with, just going to the website and finding out who your person is, and just give them a call. And there's some amazing people here that have got a wealth of knowledge it's pretty amazing. And then we have specialists backing us up, if I haven't experienced it, it's amazing how many people in our network that I can call and get that information from, and find something that I've never seen before. And I'm always asking a question, and you always get asked the weird question too. So you get enough people, that have been asked a lot of questions over a lot of years, and you can find a lot of answers that you never would have thought you would have ever been asked, really.
Great.
So, yeah.
All right. Thanks for your time today, Jay.
Yeah.
So again, I want to thank Jay for taking time to sit down with me. And really, I think it's an important reminder beyond the message that he gave us that when we do this, whether you've got a soil health partnership field manager locally to work with, or it's your local agronomist, or whomever you're working with to help you, we always have several people in extension and at our land grant universities that we can tap into. I now want to go back to Mike Jordan and visit with him some more about his rotation, and specifically how his rotation is helping him with weed control, soil health, and labor issues across all the different growing seasons on his farm. So you talked a little bit before about the variety of the crops that are part of your rotation. So tell me a little bit historically about wheat's place in your rotation. How does that earn kind of I know that's kind of the foundational piece of your crop rotation. So talk us through that.
Well, wheat has been traditionally what Kansas grows. It's the wheat state. And so as part of my rotation, its role is to provide the cover, the mulch, the wheat straw. Wheat has surprisingly durable straw, being it has a carbon-nitrogen ratio of about 88:1. It takes a while for the bugs to break it down, and it stays on the ground. Can be up to a year, usually 10 months of cover. And being a grass that grows in the winter, well, that gives us a chance to have all summer to kill off the weeds that would normally plague the traditional row crops. The big challenge has been the last 5 years or so, we have seen the wheat price times yield deteriorate and makes it less attractive, which keeps us trying to search for more alternatives. But in the end, when I come down to really, really bad weed problems in my row crop, the simplest way to attack them is to grow a year or two of wheat and clean those things up.
Talk to me a little bit about the role that the weather plays in
wheat being so well suited for your geography here in Kansas?
Well, the growing season for wheat, we plant it in September, we harvest in late June, early July. And with our 25 inches of rainfall, we have a year fully a third or more falls in basically that end of April to the middle of June period, which coincides right with the rapid growth in the wheat and also the fill period for the grain. So from that standpoint, it's pretty well suited for our climate.
When and why did fallow phase itself out of your farm?
Well, the first blow to it came when the farm programs in '95, the Freedom to Farm Bill, told us we didn't have to leave ground out all the time. And traditionally, land was, you plant wheat, you'd fallow it a year and plant wheat again, or plant wheat, wait till spring, and plant your milo or whatever else you were going to grow, and then leave it fallow until the following fall, 11 months. And the idea was to build up some moisture in the soil. The fact was, the amount of rainfall you get during that period is way more than the soil can store. And I did grow sunflowers for quite a few years. And it wasn't until soybeans varieties improved a lot, while sunflower varieties improved a little. And soybeans had the ability to use, Roundup, to be frank, while sunflowers had terrible weed issues and very few herbicide opportunities. And cultivation of sunflowers doesn't work well because they have a lot of very shallow roots. So sunflowers have taken over that spot in my rotation about 6 years ago. Or soybeans did, I mean.
I know that with all the adoptions of drought guard tolerances and the herbicide things and all of that they put into corn, we've also seen acreage of grain sorghum decline across the entirety, especially the eastern third of Kansas, the eastern third of Nebraska, those geographies in the last 25 to 30 years. So why does, or how does, sorghum continue to have a place on your farm and earn its keep?
The sorghum is a lot more drought tolerant and a lot more predictable. Of all the crops I grow, I've had every crop I have zero out essentially at one time or another because of drought, but I've never had the grain sorghum do that. Yes, one year with a bad chinch bug infestation, I had 16 bushels an acre, but that's 10 bushels better than my worst corn yield. And it's hard to get beans to yield much less than that too, as far as that goes. But still, it's been very reliable. It's quite drought resilient. Example is this year. I have a crop behind me. We've had excellent rainfall this summer, and we have the best corn I've ever grown out there in the field, and perhaps the best grain sorghum. But there's also, the corn is now under stress. It is now the 24th of the month. We've had 1 inch of rain in the last 4 weeks now, and there's no stress behind me in the milo. It has a deep, rugged root system, and all the other crops are definitely showing stress. Even some of the weeds aren't looking so good in spots.
When we put the grain sorghum behind the wheat, it's a later planted crop than our corn and soybeans are. And we talk about that high carbon to nitrogen ratio and the need for that nitrogen to work on that wheat residue out there. Is some of that a little bit of a result of a difference in nitrogen release and fixation and all of those different components of the nitrogen cycle?
Well, that's getting a little technical. I don't have the soil test to prove it taken during the season, but there's a lot of logic to that because a lot of the wheat stubble does just break down to its constituents once you get into that May and June period. And May is when you plant your sorghum, and it doesn't really start growing until the early mid-July. It usually stays pretty tiny up until around the 4th of July. So the timing might be part of it, but I really can't say so.
So, Mike, you alluded to it a little while ago, talking about how soybeans kind of earned their place into the rotation because of some of their advantages with weed control and pieces like that. Is there a reason beyond that soybeans work so well in this multi-crop rotation that you have going on?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is the varieties have improved a lot in the last 10, 15 years. We first experimented, and I say truly it was just an experiment, with 20, 30 acres of soybeans back in the 1970s, my father and I. And we grew, the first year we got a 20 bushel yield, the second year we got a 18 bushel yield, the third year we got a 17 bushel yield, and that yield was about half dirt from having to drag the header down in the dirt, and we didn't like the trend in yields, so we just kind of gave up on it. I popped a few in the ground a couple times in the next couple decades, and saw a little bit of improvement. But really, about 10, 12 years ago, I gave them another try and found unexpectedly good yields. Never had a total failure on them. I've had it pretty darn poor, almost in the single digits, but not quite, except when it was hailed out. The other issue is they're a different set of herbicides from what we use on the milo or the corn. It's a different time of year from the wheat. It's a legume. It does different things to the soil. I don't like that it doesn't leave any ground cover once it's been harvested other than the ground up residue. But we take care of that by harvesting, or not harvesting, by planting wheat within days of harvest. And normally we have a good ground cover within a month, and it's just a good seed bed for growing the wheat. You do sacrifice a little bit of wheat yield over growing wheat following wheat, definitely over wheat and fallow. But considering that we can often grow 30 to 60 bushel beans in a period where, going back 40 years, the land would have laid completely fallow and grown nothing, there's a whole lot more profitability in growing those beans in a fallow period. And I'll give up 5 or 10 bushels an acre on my wheat to put that money in the bank.
What factors help you decide when you're going into that grass crop of grain, sorghum, or corn, whether you're going to use either one of those crops in any given year?
Well, of course, there's always a factor that corn's fun to grow because it gets so big and looks so spectacular even when it doesn't have any ears on it, unless it's only 3 feet tall. But yeah, it's easy to grow, but the place where it fits in is I can plant it a month before I plant anything else. And that helps spread the load out a little bit. It's kind of nice when you're locked out of the field in May and you can't plant anything because it's raining. We say, well, at least it's good for the corn. The primary reason, though, I've been drawn to growing some of it is to put it on fields where I need the extra herbicide options to help suppress weeds that can't be controlled in grain sorghum. And it may just suppress things like shatter cane, but that's a whole lot better than what happens when shatter cane is out in a milo field where they're the same species. And if the grain sorghum grows good, the shatter cane is going to grow even better.
We'll circle back around to that diversity and that here in just a second, but you touched on something I think is incredibly important to talk about as well, and that is for a family operation, there's still a lot more to do than 2 or 3 of you can handle on a day in and day out basis. How does the diversity of all of these different crops help you from a labor standpoint and a time standpoint, because you have to have somebody deliver it to terminals and things like that as well?
Well, we find with everything we need to spray it sometime in the spring, but we're done with all the pre-plant stuff and planting corn in April usually. And then we flow right into soybeans. And usually when you're planting corn, it's a little too early to plant soybeans, and you flow from that into planting the grain sorghum, and which usually goes in the last half of May, the early part of June. So you've just spread the planting season out over 2 months without any deleterious effects. Then you're harvesting wheat in late June, which gives you all summer to treat your wheat stubble, while the sprayer would be sitting idle if it was growing beans or corn after you've done your post-emerge on them. So we're able to use the that a bit of labor and take care of that ground over the 2 or 3 months before we pull into the fall season, where we start by harvesting beans. Usually fall, and right after the beans, we put the wheat in the ground in October, and then usually the corn's ready by then, if not earlier. We can harvest the corn in mid-October, and the grain sorghum's usually ready the last week of October, the first week or two of November. So it really gives us about a 6 or 7 month field work period. And then we're all ready for terrace maintenance, conservation work, fertilizing, whatever else that goes on in the winter. You know, the wheat is going to need fertility. We've got to take care of that. And before you know it, we're getting the fertility in the ground for the corn and milo. So it spreads things out.
With the different root structures that we see with the crops and the way that they use moisture from different areas of the field, how do you think that benefits the soil itself and helps progress the goals that you have to work towards better organic matter and better nitrogen release and cycling and those pieces?
Well, that gets pretty complicated here. The different crops make a difference because wheat is relatively shallow rooted to the top 18 inches, but it has a fairly dense, fine root system, and it does a good job of holding the ground together while it's growing. Then you have the sorghum has a deep root system. It can pull up the nitrogen and other nutrients from down deep, something that the rain may have taken out of the reach of the wheat. Well, the milo can go ahead and suck that up out of the soil. That was one of the advantages of growing sunflowers, and I liked them a lot. They had both a taproot that could break hardpan, and their roots can go down 5 or 6 feet, and they could find nutrients and bring them up even when you thought they should have run out. Soybeans with the legume there, they're providing more stuff, for want of a better word, to help promote the health of the microbial community in the ground. And plus, switching all these crops around is also changing the rules of the games for the weeds that are out there. Different times a year, different timing, different cover at different times, and all that helps join in there too. Now, planting cover crops to provide some competition for some of those weeds during the periods when there's no crops going sounds like a good deal to me. I'm trying to get them in. If somebody has an idea for a good additional crop to grow in my area, it's going to have to beat the money I'm making on soybeans right now. But if you can do that or provide some other benefit for me, hey, I'm going to be all for that too.
Is there anything out there that you see on the horizon or that has tickled your curiosity right now that you would want to try from a cash crop addition to your operation?
I don't know about cash crop. If I had livestock, it'd be another matter. I see people growing some of the other legumes like cowpeas, things like that. But it's not something you can just haul to the local elevator and sell. And I don't know what my neighbors would think about wanting to buy that kind of stuff from me or not. I'm just kind of keeping my eyes open a little bit to see what else might fit our climate.
Last question, is there anything that we've missed during this conversation about your crop diversity and crop rotation that you want to throw in last second?
No, I just hate to dial anything back and have less diversity. If anything, I'd like to have more. And that's why I'm trying the cover crops again, to try and get some more of that benefit. See if I can add another 0.5% or so to that, to my soil organic matter.
Mike, thank you. You have such a great perspective on how to move methodically through the exploratory process of trying new things and your experiences that you've had through the years on your farm and evaluating the success, not just from a yield standpoint, but from a number of different angles. And thank you for putting up with the swarm of sweat bees that wanted to be part of our interview process that day as well. I now want to take another trip out to the field to look at yet another way that we can do one of our own evaluations in soil health efforts
and evaluate where we are at on a side-by-side basis or from field to field. So if you would, travel back with me to the end of July, and let's walk through not only the SHP trial process and what that looks like in a little more detail, but also a simple comparison of biological activity that you can do for $10 or less. Looks like we're having a little bit of sound audio quality here. Bear with us just a second. And welcome to the Justin Kanoff farm here at Gypsum, Kansas. This is one of our SHP wheat trial sites that is in its first year. And in fact, first year, as you can see, the wheat was harvested about the 2nd of July this year. We're at the end of the month, and we've had just the wrong frequency or right frequency of rain, depending on how you want to talk about it. That means that we haven't had the right opportunity to get out here and seed this with the cover crop mix that we intend to, without being detrimental to our soil structure, without being in a soil that's a little too wet to do so. So the good part is here being that it's still the end of July. We're in Kansas. We've got a lot of growing season left behind us, or ahead of us, if you will, to go through the rest of the year, to get our cover crop established and to see these managements put into place. But before I go any further, I do want to back up just one step and talk about our trial that we've got going on here. This is an SHP partner trial, and within a partner trial, what we see is strips of what we've got going on out here. We actually call them strip trials now. So this will be a replicated cover crop versus control trial that we've got going on out here. And right now, this is actually going to be one of our control areas. And sometimes when we do field days, we have the opportunity to already show you something that's happened, to show you the practice that's in place that leads to this result and so on down the road. But like I said, this is year number 1 of our practice being put into place on this field. This has been alfalfa for several years, and this was the first wheat crop that's been put in it, or first row crop, if you will, that's been in it in several years. So today basically starts day number 1 of the trial process, and we're going to get a baseline today of what our biological activity is out here going forward with something that's been around the internet for quite some time. The name might be a little crude, but it's basically called the Soil Your Undies test. We've got a pair of Homer Simpson white underwear here that we're going to bury down in the soil about 6 inches deep. And we're going to leave this here the rest of the summer and fall. And as we get forward here another week and we get the cover crops planted on the other side of this strip, we're going to have the opportunity to see if there's a difference in the biological activity. Is there a difference in what the earthworms are doing, the bacteria are doing, the rhizobia, the funguses, all of those different components that are alive and living in our soils? Do they behave the same when everything's been the same up to this point, or do they change because we've added that stimulation of roots and activity going on out here? So, you know, that, and really that's the gist of what we want to do anytime we talk about soil health, and especially as we talk about cover crops in our fields, is it's this idea that instead of this field basically setting fallow with nothing growing on it, no sunlight being converted into sugars and put down into the soil for the next 6 or 7 months, instead of that, for the next 3 or 4 months until we hit that hard freeze date, we're going to have something growing out here. We're going to have something pumping sugars down into the soil, and in theory and I believe in reality, those sugars are going to feed that biological activity. They're going to make the earthworms want to be present there. They're going to make those bacteria stay active and not go into hibernation. And all of those things are going to lead to more cycling of nutrients, more cycling of organic matter, more cycling of nitrogen, and just the beginning of putting that snowball into motion instead of just letting it sit there. So we're going to start now. We're going to dig this pit and go into this. So first step when we're doing this is we want to clear away our soil a little bit to get a good clean spot to put this. get a spot that's, you know, approximately a foot by a foot here. And like I said, we're just going to go in, and it's going to be approximately a 6-inch hole. Now, I know what many of you that are wheat producers are thinking right now. The corn producer in me wouldn't necessarily think of this, but there's no doubt that there's going to be some volunteer wheat here that becomes more active and grows that wouldn't have necessarily, just because of what I'm doing here with disturbing the soil. And you're absolutely right. So anytime we're in real world agriculture, we know that the idea and the idea and the practical application don't always match up with what we've got going on out here. So, you know, the first comment I'll kind of make here as I'm digging is that we definitely have a nice tilt to this soil. It's been raining pretty much the entire month of July, which is why that cover crop's not in, but this soil shovel's nice. Good moisture throughout it. It's a good baseline for where we want to be to start this off, and that's going to be about right for what we want. So we're just going to take this pair, lay them down in here like so. I know some people, if you look on the internet and watch videos of what people do, I know some people like to put that corner or even the entire waistband above the surface and let that be. I'm not a big fan of that, just because I know how the badgers and the raccoons and things like that are. If you give them something to tear into, that's probably what they're going to do. So just simply gonna do the replacement here of what we've got. And I'll try to keep as much of the straw out of here as I can. Hack it down, and then I'm going to try to replace the cover that was above it here, just so it's protected from wind and rain erosion as much as we can. And no doubt it'll sink a little bit, but that in a nutshell is the process of preparing a site for the Soil Your Undies Challenge, if you will. I've moved over here now to the cover crop site where they're going to be planted, and I began to dig my hole, and immediately on the first shovel I saw something here that was significantly different than where I was digging in the past. And if you can see it here in this white, I don't want to use the term crust, but this white residue that's left here on the soil, we had an alfalfa crown that was going down in the soil. There's part of the old alfalfa root, taproot right there, going into this soil. And we definitely had some major biological activity going on around that alfalfa crown root. In fact, you can even see a couple of the small worms that we had working around that. And if I were to proceed on with this exact location and bury those cotton underwear right here, we would definitely see a difference in the decomposition of those, just because of the biological activity that's already started here. So I'm going to fill this hole back in. I'm going to move about 4 foot further to the north and start it again. Okay, so dug a new hole just to the north of that last one. And again, I want to reiterate here that the idea about what we're talking about and where we're starting with this today is not just about where we are. It's about where we're going, right? The whole concept of soil health is never as simple as one given practice and one given thing. And it's not just about the fact that we plant cover crops on this side and we don't plant cover crops over there, and we get to see some sort of a difference down the road in what we're doing, whether that's the soil testing that we do at SHP that's in relation to this. We basically do a 1 acre grid that lines up with each one of these strips on our strip site here and do that. We also do the soil health test. We do those things We do those things like aggregate stability and organic matter and active carbon and those pillars of soil health, and look at those differences on a strip by strip basis. Of course, we're always measuring yield when we do this, because yield is such an important component about making sure that these things are profitable and that we have the opportunity to be successful and do these practices on more acres. It's all of those things that go into making up one of our SHP trials. It's all of those things that combine the idea of what the farmer wants to see on their farm. In this case, for Justin, this is a newer piece of ground to them. This is not a piece of ground that they've had long term, and it wasn't necessarily historically some of the top producing ground in the country. We're over a river valley here. We're up on some higher ground. We definitely don't have those beautiful bottom ground soils and the moisture that goes with those bottom ground soils here. So in this case, this is a soil that he wanted to find out a way to jumpstart the biological activity on. So it went into alfalfa production first to kind of give it a period to find a baseline and to get started in that. And then it went into a wheat production scenario here. And now we're implementing these cover crops to see how more species in that rotation, how more days of sunlight being converted into the sugars affects the biological activity. And the idea is not about what it does in yield next year or what it does in yield 2 or 3 years from now. It's about 5 years down the road or even longer. What are the measurable differences? Maybe the yield is exactly the same. Maybe the yield is 1 or 2 bushel less. But if we've increased organic matter significantly across this 10, 15, 20% increase in organic matter, if we see more biological activity in those soil health tests, if we see more carbon being stored on these soils, more carbon being sequestered as we see carbon markets emerging, there's a lot of different yardsticks that we can use to measure that. And something simple like this isn't necessarily a translation into any one of those yardsticks by itself, but it is the visual reminder. It's even the visual stimulation that sometimes we need to continue on this journey when we're not seeing the signs. We're not seeing the yield. We're not seeing the soil test results. We're not seeing some of those things that we would want to see right off the bat that would indicate that we're being successful. But if we can do a simple test like this this is something that any of you can do on your own farm for $10. This is something that helps you begin to understand how some of these practices are making a difference even when we can't measure them with conventional methods on our farm. We've decided to add a third piece to this component today, a trial into what we're talking about on this. Now, this isn't a wheat field right now. This is a cover crop grazing field that Justin's got going on down here. And this is kind of like pushing the fast forward button on the SHP plot. So we've moved about 10 miles to the southwest from where we were before, and we've crossed a river valley, and we've got a completely different soil type here versus what we've got over at our SHP plot. But the ideas are still the same. This again is another one of the pieces of ground that they have that may not be the most productive piece of ground they have. It may not be the top yielder that they've got out of it, and they want to find a way to accelerate and to jumpstart this field. So about 100 yards up the driveway here, we've got the fence out right now where the cattle and the calves are at, and doing the grazing on this. And we're going to get an opportunity to walk out in the field while we go bury our cotton patch out there and see some of the biological activity that we've got going on. But the idea is not only that we've got a cover crop here that is growing down into that soil with a whole lot of different species and stimulating different rhizobia, different bacteria, different fungi and all of that, but we've also got the concept going on here of what happens when those cattle come in and they graze it. What happens when they're pulling on those plants and those roots release those exudates, and that those exudates kind of serve as a glue that binds those soil particles together. And what does that do to this idea of pushing the biological activity and jump starting it into this decomposition phase and doing the things that we want to see it do. So we're going to go out, we're going to bury these, and we're going to come back a little while down the road and see if there's a difference in how fast the bacteria, how fast the biological activity is working on this field after it's been grazed and bounced back from that and moved on to its next management practice versus where the covers are going to be over there on the SHP plot for the rest of the season. So here underneath the canopy of some of our grazing forage that we see here, you can see down into the canopy that we've got a lot of other things going on. We've got some sunflowers, we've got some, it looks like some radishes going on, we've got some different brassicas in here, we've got a lot of different little components going on down here, and we're going to pick this spot right here to bury our undies and flag it out and see what we have in a few weeks. So you can see I kind of did the best that I could in here of trying to be in between all of the different species that we had going on, but trying to leave them as much intact as we could. Big challenge with all of the different seed sizes and the dispersion of them as they got planted out here, but here we are, we're buried in there about 6 inches deep. And we're going to go ahead and cover this back up and see what it looks like. So down the road, we'll have the second part of this video. As we get later in the fall, we'll go out and collect those undies and see what we have coming back on the tail end of this test. And again, there's no reason you can't go do this yourself on your farm or even your garden for just a few dollars. I do need to pause for just a second and thank our intern, Chris Borney, of this last summer at Soil Health Partnership for all of her help this summer, helping me with videos in the field and things like that, being behind the scenes. We saw her a couple of times here today. I now want to close the loop today by going back to where we started and continuing our conversation with Justin and Garrett. Justin planted a field, the one we just saw, to that multi-species cover crop, to use for grazing, even though they don't own any cattle in their operation. So we're going to visit with Justin about the thought process of committing ground to that, setting goals with his neighbor who owns the cow herd, and the economics of doing this, and finally, what will define success for this endeavor. So why is alfalfa part of what you do and what you utilize as a crop on your farm?
A couple reasons. One, economics. Alfalfa year in and year out economically is one of our most profitable cropping enterprises. I think part of the reason for that is it's a perennial. So our variable costs every year, we're not buying seed every year, although there's significant seed cost up front. But as we spread that across 5 to 6 years life of a stand, we have lower seed costs. We're making all of our own nitrogen across the life of that crop, so a lot less fertilizer use. And a lot of the times when we're going out to do operations in our alfalfa fields, they're harvesting operations. So we're harvesting something to bring in for revenue versus spraying or seeding or fertilizing, which is spending money. So I think the inherentness of it being perennial and having the lower the variable costs leads to better profitability across time. So the economic piece is really important, a part of why it's part of our cropping system. Agronomically, I really like having a perennial as part of our cropping system. It's been, as we originally transitioned into no-till 20 years ago, a lot of farmers and folks have heard about that kind of transition period as the soil transitions and starts to build some structure. There's about a 5-year period that's, can be challenging. And alfalfa was a great way to overcome that and to walk through that challenging period when that soil is beginning to develop and have some structure in the absence of tillage. It takes some time. So having a perennial there doing that, I think, was a great way for us to go through that season on some of our fields. I like the long, deep taproot that alfalfa brings into our cropping system. We have a lot of clay in our soil, so always struggle with poor infiltration. It's one of my inherent challenges is to improve our water infiltration, and I feel alfalfa helps us do that by having those long, deep taproots that put those big macropores into the soil that stay in place for years. We observe after we take that alfalfa stand out and begin going into our annual cropping system. So we really like having a perennial in our system, both agronomically, from a diversity standpoint, and economically. It is one of our better returning cropping enterprises.
So Justin, you provided a perfect segue there as you talked about the perennials. So I know it's important to you to have that mix of diversity that mimics what was somewhat native for the plains. So talk about the rest of the mixes there.
Yeah, when we look at our overall big picture of our cropping system and think about our most important motivating factors, are number one, I think, would be just resiliency across time. And so how can we build that? And we're farming out here where we had native prairie, and the prairie, everyone knows, is incredibly resilient. So what are the factors that we can take and learn from the prairie and implement into our cropping system while also being economically profitable, while also still maximizing our production and being a steward of the resource, the gift of the resource that we have to produce food and life-sustaining products for a growing population. But then do it in a way to where we are restoring natural resources, or at least ways moving them in the direction of improvement versus degradation. So those are the big picture things that we look at our cropping system. And one of the things that to me is inherently necessarily or obviously necessary is diversity in that system, because that's one of the main factors of the native prairie, is that diversity of plant type, both from, it has presence of broadleaves and grasses. Prairies have, well, when we look at our cropping system, we try to check those boxes of diversity. So I'll talk about it in that way. Both broadleaves and grasses. We'd like to have annuals and perennials in our cropping system. We talked about alfalfa being a perennial in our cropping system, but it also has some weaknesses because it's a perennial monoculture. So that brings some weaknesses into it as well. And also it's a legume, so very low C to N ratio, so we're not building a lot of carbon during that time. And we're also removing a lot of phosphorus off that land. So one other spot we're looking at is maybe doing that we're going to start learning about on a small level, is putting a perennial mix in place for purposes of grazing. So that brings more diversity and brings a perennial into our cropping system, and some economic return by being able to sublease out that ground to a livestock producer that can graze a little bit. So that's a project we're just leaning into now. But back to our cropping system. So broadleaf grass, and we try to look at warm season and cool season on both broadleaves and grasses, and where we have holes of plant types and diversity, that's where we're trying to plug those holes or add more diversity of plant type with our multi-species cover crops. So we're putting brassicas. We don't grow any brassicas as a revenue crop or a cash crop on our farm, so we're putting turnips and radishes and rapeseed into our cover crop mixes, and then also warm season broadleaves, where we have soybeans, but that's a warm season legume. We're trying to in our warm season summer annual covers, we're trying to put sunflowers in, also some flax. We use some cabbage and kale out here in this mix, but just trying to add more diversity through those multi-species cover crops to plug some of those holes that we're missing in our cash crops as far as a diversity standpoint.
So aside from the diversity aspect, the cattle are being shy right now and decided not to be on camera, but what are the things that you see when you stand out here in this field today that you really like, that make you proud of what you're doing out here?
Well, I'm not I'm proud of a few things we're doing out here, and I'm mostly proud that we're learning, because we've made a lot of mistakes also, and I tend to focus on our mistakes, but we've learned from those mistakes. We've overgrazed some of the area out here. We've had too much back grazing and removed too much cover. The area we're standing in now is more what my goal and my vision of what we wanted to see here. So what I like about what we're seeing here is we still have the ground 100% covered. We've removed about 40 to 50%, just kind of eyeballing the best we can of the biomass that we've grown. We've got good diversity. It's harder to see now at this stage, but there's a lot of broadleaves out here that the cattle have selected and eaten. And so it's hard to see them right now with all the high carbon, high residue material we have. I like what I see in the soils. So we're thinking about building structure, and we're kind of dry right now, but to be able to take our spade out here and to get soils that stick together like this in big chunks, even despite being dry, I'm really pleased with seeing that, because that tells me that we're building structure. That means we have biology happening, which is what it takes to build this structure, and that when we have rain and other 4 or 5 inch rainfall events, that this soil is going to infiltrate that water well. It's not going to be leaving the field, and it's not going to be blowing apart, because we have good structure, and also we have armor on top of the soil. So what we're really trying to do here is implement in real time basically 5 principles on that we can see here of building soil health. And so that is keeping armor on the top of the soil. We have that. We've got the soil very well covered. Increasing diversity. I think we had 8 or 9 different plant species in the mix out here, so we're increasing diversity far above and beyond what it is in our normal cropping system. We're trying to have a live root growing all year round. This is the first time we've done this full season grazing mix, so we had triticale cover crop ahead of this full season mix, so we've got a live root in the ground 12 months out of the year. Minimizing disturbance, our seeding, anytime we're seeding out here, we are no-till seeding with a single disc, so our disturbance is very minimal. Also thinking about minimizing disturbance from herbicides and pesticides as well. We've decreased our fertilizer and our synthetic input use here as well, so decreasing that disturbance. And then the 5th one is the integration of livestock. So all of our prairie soils were formed, and then in their native state had a livestock impact on them from bison and a ruminant animal grazing across them. So we've that piece we are just barely getting into in our cropping system. I know very little about cattle and don't have the management space to be able to manage and learn a lot about them. So I am partnering with a friend and a neighbor of mine who we sat down and made some common goals. I shared with him my vision for how I would like to begin to learn how to integrate livestock back into our cropping system on some of our crop lands. And he was wanting to expand his herd, needed some more limited on pasture in this area on native grasses. So this gave him a way to expand his herd and to have some place to go graze outside of utilizing native pasture or giving some of his native grasses a break during an important part of the year. So we agreed upon our common goals, and like I said, we made some mistakes, but we're learning from those mistakes and really trying to move forward in the trajectory of the resource on our farm.
So what happens when this piece of ground hits the end of grazing season for this year? How do you go about terminating this and preparing it for what is next, and how do you prepare it for what is next? after this?
We did this break after grain sorghum. We planted a full season triticale, we planted triticale cover crop after grain sorghum, so that would have been actually really late. It was around Thanksgiving time last fall. And then let that triticale grow through the spring, and then seeded this full season grazing mix green into that triticale, and then terminated that triticale with herbicide within 24 hours of seeding this. And then we put, I think, 50 units of nitrogen out here, and that's really the only input other than seed that this has had. We have been doing daily moves. We've got 36 mama cows out here, and we're doing daily moves. And we'll see how many grazing animal unit grazing days we have at the end of this. But I think I think both myself and my partner who has the cattle is going to be pleased with the amount of grazing that we've got out of this. So our next step after we finish grazing it, I think I'm going to seed triticale back into this again this fall to again keep that live root going 12 months out of the year. And then this will go to soybeans this coming spring, which we will seed into that triticale cover crop.
So Justin, I know one of the questions I would have as a fellow grower would be, you mentioned a couple of times that this is a typical row crop production field for you, and you've taken a year on this field and done something different with the grazing of it. Is it economically feasible to take it out of row crop production when you look at the inputs and all those things that you've mentioned already, and do this on a number of fields in any given year?
I think that's, I think it's really easy to get lost talking about soil health and growing cover crops and doing these really warm sounding, fuzzy sounding things, and not face the reality that also economically it's got to work. It's got to be sustainable economically. If I'm integrating some of these things that are great for the environment, great for society, reducing our erosion, making our water and our air cleaner and our soil healthier, but I'm not competitive economically compared to some other guy who's not doing those things, and within 5 or 10 years I can't keep up on land prices and paying for my inputs and paying cash rents, and not competitive, and he's farming it in 5 years anyways, it's not going to do a darn bit of good. So the economic piece is important, and it's hard to answer in this a little bit. And so that's why we're starting at a very small scale with this, just selecting one field. And so the economic return for me is going to come in two ways. It's going to come from significantly reduction in cost and the amount of money that I'm putting into this field compared to what I typically would be doing had we had just gone into our soybean crop this year. The amount I'll put in probably, well, we'll see when we're all said and done, but I would estimate probably about 30% of the cost that I would put in compared to growing a full season soybean. The revenue is going to come from the value that the livestock producer that I'm working with has through the grazing. So at the end of the season, and that needs to work for him too, right? But at the end of the season, he received value by being able to sustain his cattle out here through grazing. And we've had some conversation about that, but he'll write me a check for the value and the time and the animal unit days that he's had out here grazing. So that's where the revenue is going to come from. There's also some economic pieces that are hard to measure, and those are the pieces that I'm hopeful some of these soil health partnership sites can measure, but things like how much soil aggregate stability did we build? How much resiliency will I have by taking this rest, if you will, the season of rest for this farm, and how much will we increase our production for the next 7 years or 6 years? When our grain crop 2 years from now is facing a dry period like we're in now, will it be able to be a little bit more resilient and hang on for 5 more days compared to if we weren't making this investment into carbon and diversity and rest that I think I think will make a difference, but those are really hard numbers to get at economically. So economics is incredibly important, and we're doing the best we can to measure those. Sometimes in the biological system, some of the more nuanced parts of the economics is hard to measure. And I think in some instances, that's where, for me personally, just observation and faith in how what I observe from science, and just also the rhythms of creation around me and trying to mimic those have to come in and make up for some of the shortfalls that I feel being able to measure down to the dollar of what we've done economically. And that's going to be different for each person and how they approach their land and the stewardship of their land. But for me, that's the conversation and how we are arriving at this point and where we're going moving forward.
All right, Garrett. So as we had that conversation with Justin about economics, I have to carry that thought process out further.
Sure.
And I know that you guys have fields where you're using a monoculture like triticale as a cover crop. I know you've got fields like our research site where you're using a mix of products as a cover crop species mix. Talk me through the economics of what kind of inputs you guys put in on either one of those comparatively, and how you justify those costs on the backside.
Sure. Well, as an agronomist, I've also got to tie agronomy into it, of course. One of the main reasons we're using a monoculture like triticale is just that time window. So when we're seeding that triticale in late fall, sometimes after our milo comes off, so into November, we've tried running rapeseed with it. We've tried different clovers, different legumes, but unfortunately we just don't have enough time to get that crown real well established before that freeze comes in. And so we've been really challenged in that regard. We're still adding some rapeseed in a few areas if we're seeding it early enough, but we're just trying to figure out what the best way to do that is. And so where we're drilling typically 60 to 70 pounds of triticale in the fall is running us kind of that $10 to $11 per acre in just seed cost for the triticale. We've really liked triticale in our area. I know a lot of guys to the east have used the cereal rye and getting along really well with that. Here in wheat country, rye is kind of a bad word, of course, and so not only that with volunteer concerns, but really what we have found is rye heads so much earlier and matures so much faster. We just don't have enough, we don't get that growth out of it in the spring before that head comes through and we have to terminate it. And where we're trying to build as much lignin into the plant so we can have as much residue stick around through the summer as possible, we really want to stretch that out as far as we can, and so that's why we've liked triticale. Triticale also is a lot more aggressive in root growth as well as top growth than what wheat is, and so we've liked that from a carbon building standpoint, a cover building standpoint, and all those metrics and things Justin visited about. So anyway, so we're kind of running that $11 in seed cost. What we found in the summer, we've got a lot more time, of course, before that freeze comes in, and we can really, what we feel, get the bang for our buck in regards to adding more diversity and different species. And so in that Soil Health Partnership trial field, we've got 9 pounds of a pearl millet, 4 pounds of sorghum sudan, 2 pounds of sunflowers, 2 pounds of flax, and then 1 pound each of radish and turnip. So we're getting multi-species diversity. We're getting different height differences in the canopy and how that translates to ground cover and carbon and staying power of that residue. That mix this year cost us $23, so it's basically double of what the triticale cost is.
So I imagine, as I kind of peek behind the curtain, I would ask either one of you guys this: how far ahead do you guys have to have a plan on paper to keep track of the rotations and things like that?
Yeah, as with any farm family, the plan is subject to change, right? And continues to ebb and flow as different outside influences weigh on that, hard, heavy rains, that kind of thing. And so we do have a spreadsheet that we try to track and kind of have an idea of what we're going to grow next and that kind of thing. 2 years ago, well, in the summer of 19, On July 4th, we went to bed that night on the 3rd with a 60% chance of a 1/4 inch. We woke up with 8 inches of rain. Just devastating rainfall. It impacted a lot of people in town, a lot of people around. Really cut up our ground in a number of areas. And so if we have those severe weather events, how does that, of course, influence, and can we get back to wheat in order to get some carbon back in the system, roots reestablished, that kind of thing. So that always has to change. But sure, we have an idea of what we're going with next, and if we have to go to plan B or C or D, then of course we'll do that.
So Garrett, to kind of wrap up today, from an agronomist standpoint, what would be your advice, or what would be your words of wisdom that you would share with other agronomists out there that are working with growers that are on the cusp of beginning to change away from just a monoculture or dual culture system, and adding more diversity to their farm?
Well, sure, that's a good question, and I'd kind of have two things. First is just be open. Be open to new ideas. Be open to looking and observing at things differently than we have before. We don't have it figured out, and that's one of the things I think we've learned and been humbled by, is that as we change little things, the system is much more connected as a whole than what we even imagined. And so, yeah, if we press one thing here, it really affects things down the line. And so be open to those new ideas, but also to observing what changes you're making. And secondly is really just try it. Maybe you can devote the back 40 that people don't see along the highway, or whatever that is, but just try in small acreages first to kind of see how that system changes, but then be willing also, once you've observed positive growth, to make that change quickly and move fast so that we can then make more changes on down the road. So yeah, those would just be my 2 bits of advice, is really be open, but also try it on the back patch and then be quick to adapt as you go forward.
So all too often, I think we talk about almost all of the aspects of this endeavor into soil health, and we don't take time to talk about the money aspect of it. So I really sincerely thank Justin for being willing to talk with us about that. I can also appreciate the challenges that agronomists like Garrett have to navigate when they work with growers who don't always accept the status quo and are committed to invest the time and money to see what's next over the horizon. I do want to take a moment here to revisit an earlier part of our conversation with Justin about the quality of the wheat they grow and how that moves through the supply chain to the consumer. We at SHP realized a year ago that this is one of the unique aspects of wheat we don't necessarily deal with when we look at some of our other cash crops. So this year, we began a pilot program to also measure the quality of our grain on our wheat sites. We worked with the lab to give us a report on FGIS grade, protein content, and a farinograph this year test that looks at the flour and dough quality from our samples. This was conducted on a strip-by-strip basis, and so far we've only gotten results from fields that are in their first or baseline year of implementing their soil health practices, which means that those results are laying the foundation to evaluate any future differences we might see from adopting these management practices on a strip-by-strip basis. And the results that we did see this year were consistent from strip to strip, as we would expect, and did just that, laid a great foundation for us to move forward and see comparisons in the future. So once again, as a reminder, if you would please submit any questions you have via the chat, and please join us tomorrow when all of our SHP farmers and growers will be with us to close out Wheat Week, the culmination of Wheat Week, with our question and answer session at the end of our Minnesota session. So if you have not already, please go to soilhealthpartnership.org/events and register for the 3rd and final day of Wheat Week tomorrow. And once again, thank you for joining us today. If you go to soilhealthpartnership.org, you can locate your local field manager, connect with us on social media, and find upcoming webinars or listen to our podcasts and read our latest blogs. Thanks everyone for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.